The train screeched along the worn tracks, its dull hum filling the crowded carriage where people sat buried in newspapers, glowing phones, or in the haze of their own thoughts. Among them was Daniel Carter, a man whose tired frame blended so easily into the background that most passengers never noticed him. His jacket was faded at the seams, his shoes scuffed, and his shoulders slumped forward with the weight of exhaustion that no amount of rest could heal. A small, dented lunchbox rested on his lap, pink with tiny cartoon stickers peeling from the sides, clearly belonging to his daughter, Emma. He held it like a treasure, careful not to let it slip. A businessman in a polished suit scowled when Daniel accidentally brushed against his briefcase, muttering something about people who don't watch where they're going. A pair of teenagers snickered at the patched knees of Daniel's jeans, nudging each other as if mocking him gave them purpose. But Daniel, worn and weary, said nothing. He simply lowered his gaze, letting their judgment wash over him like rain on glass. What none of them knew was that behind those weary eyes lay stories untold, stories of deserts, missions, and decisions that once carried the weight of nations. Years ago, Daniel had commanded respect with a single word, but now, in this ordinary train car, he was invisible, reduced to just another tired single father doing his best to survive. He leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment, not in sleep but in silent prayer that Emma's school day would be good, that the bills waiting at home could somehow be stretched another week, that the world would just give him a little more time to keep going. Around him, conversations and laughter buzzed, but no one saw the quiet strength he carried, the sacrifices etched deep in his soul. To them, Daniel Carter was nothing more than a weary man in worn clothes, but the truth was far greater, if only they had looked closer. Daniel's life had not always been confined to crowded trains and weary days of juggling two jobs while raising his daughter alone. There was a time when he wore a uniform pressed so sharply it could cut, a time when his chest carried the weight of medals earned not from vanity but from sacrifice, a time when the sound of his voice carried authority that men trusted with their lives. Years ago, Daniel Carter had been a decorated officer, leading missions in places most of the world only heard about in passing news reports, his calm under fire the anchor that steadied his soldiers when chaos raged around them. But life had shifted the moment Emma's mother passed away unexpectedly, leaving him with a little girl who needed more than a distant father sending postcards from foreign lands. She needed him at home, reading bedtime stories and packing lunches, wiping tears and teaching her how to ride a bike. So he had laid aside the rank, the title, and the salutes, trading it all for the quiet, unseen duty of fatherhood. Still, the habits of his past clung to him in ways no civilian could understand. On the train he would instinctively scan every face, mark the exits, note who fidgeted too much or carried themselves with the stiff posture of training, all while pretending to be just another man lost in thought. Once, when a group of rowdy teenagers boarded, their loud voices echoing through the car, he tracked every movement without realizing, his mind calculating possibilities, risks, outcomes, as if combat could erupt at any second. "What are you staring at, old man?" one of them sneered, snapping him back into the present, and Daniel lowered his gaze quickly, unwilling to cause trouble, though every instinct in his body bristled. To the passengers, he looked strange, perhaps paranoid, but the truth was that muscle memory from years of service never truly left. Now, his service medals sat in a shoebox tucked under Emma's bed, dusty and forgotten by the world, while his daughter's drawings decorated the refrigerator with pride. He no longer commanded soldiers, but he commanded himself to keep moving forward, no matter how tired, no matter how invisible. What no one around him knew was that even stripped of his uniform, Daniel Carter was still a man built for battle, only now, the battlefield was life itself, and every day he fought for Emma. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, and a cluster of young soldiers in freshly pressed uniforms stepped aboard, their laughter loud, their chatter careless, their boots squeaking slightly against the floor as they made their way down the aisle, drawing admiring glances from several passengers who whispered about their courage and discipline, though Daniel, sitting quietly with Emma's pink lunchbox in his lap, simply lowered his eyes and said nothing. He had been one of them once, young, proud, unshakable, but now he looked like a shadow of a man, worn and invisible, and so the soldiers passed by without noticing him. They slouched into their seats, laughing at jokes and nudging each other with the energy of men still fresh in their service, but something about their posture made Daniel wince. Their covers were tilted wrong, their shoulders too relaxed, their behavior too loose for men in uniform, and though he told himself to stay silent, his instincts broke free. In a voice low but edged with authority, he muttered, "Square your shoulders, son. A soldier never forgets who he represents." One of the young men stiffened, his head snapping toward Daniel, confusion flickering in his eyes before recognition dawned, and he whispered with disbelief, "Sir." Daniel looked up then, his gaze steady though his body was weary, and with a subtle flick of his fingers, a silent hand signal drilled into every soldier's memory, the young man shot up straight as a board, snapping into full attention. The other soldiers, startled, glanced between their friend and the stranger, until Daniel gave the smallest nod, a motion only they would understand, and in an instant, every one of them stood at attention, their voices silent, their respect absolute. Gasps rippled through the train car, businessmen and students craning their necks to understand why these proud young soldiers now stood rigid before a man in a tattered jacket holding a child's lunchbox. The same teenagers who had laughed at Daniel earlier shrank into their seats, wide-eyed, and the businessman who had scolded him for bumping into his briefcase now shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Passengers whispered in awe, their eyes darting between the soldier's discipline and the quiet man who had commanded it without raising his voice. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter was not invisible, the world around him was finally seeing a glimpse of who he truly was. The train car was utterly silent except for the steady clatter of wheels against the tracks, every pair of eyes locked on the strange scene unfolding before them, young soldiers standing rigid in perfect formation, saluting a man who, moments before, had been dismissed as nothing more than a tired commuter with shabby clothes and weary eyes. One soldier, his voice barely above a whisper, finally spoke, "General Carter, we didn't know." Daniel's throat tightened at the sound of his old title, a name he had not heard in years, one that carried with it memories of commands shouted over gunfire, of men who had followed him into the storm and never returned. He didn't correct the young man, didn't remind him that he was no longer a general, just a single father who packed lunches and worked late shifts, because in their eyes, in this moment, the man he once was had never left. The businessman who had earlier glared at him now lowered his gaze in shame, realizing the depth of his arrogance, while the teenagers who had mocked Daniel's jeans shrank against the wall, their bravado evaporating. A soldier bent to pick up a small photograph that had slipped from Daniel's pocket, a picture of Emma grinning with missing teeth, her arm wrapped around his neck, and he handed it back with a reverent nod. "She must be proud, sir," the young man said quietly. Daniel's tired face softened, and his voice cracked as he replied, "She's the only reason I keep going." The word struck the soldiers with more weight than any order, for they saw not just a decorated leader before them but a man who had sacrificed glory for love, who had chosen fatherhood over fame. As the train pulled into the next station, Daniel rose, still clutching Emma's lunchbox, and stepped into the aisle. The soldiers snapped into salute once more, their crisp movements echoing louder than any applause, and to the astonishment of the passengers, every civilian in the car instinctively rose to their feet, some bowing their heads, others simply watching in hushed respect as he passed. For once, Daniel Carter was not invisible, he was honored, not for his medals, not for his rank, but for the strength of a man who carried his battles quietly and won them every day for the sake of his little girl.